Welcome to the Cross-Cultural Psych Podcast with Professor Paul Youngbin Kim. This podcast features conversations on the intersection of psychology, culture, and faith with renowned scholars in psychology and related fields. And now, here is Dr. Paul Youngbin Kim.
Dr. Raedene Copeland is the founder of Achieve Brand Consulting, a global leadership brand development consultancy. She delivers captivating keynotes and transformative trainings on leadership as a global language to support organizations' missional goals and develop leaders of distinction. For the past decade, she has served both as a tenured professor of apparel merchandising and design, and most recently, an assistant provost for the Faculty and Research Development Office. Despite living in the U.S. for the past 25 years, she remains grounded in her Trinbagonian culture and committed to spotlighting the diaspora's holistic brilliance. She currently serves as the board chair for His Excellency Ambassador Anthony Philip Spencer's Women's Roundtable Action Platform of Trinidad and Tobago Initiative. A holder of a PhD in Consumer, Apparel, and Retail Studies from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, Dr. Copeland's primary published area of research is on the younger generation's impact on the evolution of dress at Trinidad Carnival. She has also published on active learning spaces. Throughout her educational and professional pursuits, Dr. Copeland has won many leadership and service awards. Of special note is an inaugural 40 Under 40 award from her alma mater, North Carolina Central University, where she completed her bachelor's in business management and master's of business administration. A genuinely happy person, Dr. Copeland infuses joy into her leadership practice with the hope of inspiring greatness in those she serves. Take a peek into Dr. Copeland's strategic insights on leadership by reading her weekly posts on LinkedIn. Again, welcome, and you're very accomplished and have lots of insights into leadership and DEI topics, so I'm so glad that you're here. To start us off, could you give a brief overview of the work you're doing currently? And specifically anything related to leadership in DEI and belonging?
Yes, I would say that in general, my passion has always been helping others develop their full potential, right? I think that's what is grounded. So in 2016, I established Achieve Brand Consulting, but I was still primarily teaching and most recently doing that work as the assistant provost in the Faculty Research and Development Office. Now that I'm transitioning out of higher ed, I have this opportunity to go full blown into partnering with higher ed institutions and businesses and corporations to develop leaders of impact. And I will say it's not something that I was born thinking, oh, I'm going to work with leaders. No, it's just everywhere I went, somehow I ended up leading, even if I did not have it as an ambition. So I have always shared this story that I seldom pursue roles. There are people who have a very clear trajectory on, I'm going to be professor, I'm going to be provost. In fact, I didn't even really have a clear vision for higher ed. I didn't. Like, I got my PhD. I was like, okay, good. I get to develop the future generations and I would be authentic and have impact in the ways that I am talented to do so. So I think that gave me a launch pad to get that cumulative intelligence from hanging out with smart people like you, Paul, and other departments that better prepared me to complement my past experiences in sales and customer service with many of the theories, research, and discussions we had in higher ed and leading in higher ed to now come out and be able to relate to both researchers, relate to the academic audience, but also the professional audience. Because as you would know, I've always had more of an entrepreneurial mindset. And that is what I want to bring. I think I want to bring that idea that leadership should really be something that is inspirational, something that you give people space to lead in authentic ways. Because when you think DEI, most people just think of race, or originally they'll think of gender, right? So it would have been gender, in a traditionally patriarchal society. then race. And then most recently, we have the LGBTQSU, we have neurodiversity. So we have all these beautiful things that I think as international professors, international persons, we understand how it feels to be other. So in my practice, I really want to bring
mm,
that to my trainings that regardless of who is leading or what's the situation, you have to tap into somewhere where you know how it feels to be
mm,
other. And if you can tap into that, you can lead with more
mm,
empathy. And really that mainly what I'm doing. So I do this through
mm,
keynote talks and development training. And my focus is to develop leaders of distinction, but also leaders who lead a global
mm.
footprint.
Oh, you're already really articulating a wonderful vision of leadership in a way that captures, you use the phrase leaders of empathy, right? Leaders who understand how to connect with folks, including those who are marginalized or minoritized in their settings. So thank you for doing that. You mentioned your experience in higher education leadership, and you've had significant leadership roles, including being an assistant provost of faculty development. I'm curious, what were some initiatives that you implemented in that role, and especially related to teaching, but also especially related to DEI and belonging?
Well, is it okay if I talk about the
Mm-hmm.
span of some of the things I implemented at the university just because I was in that role for 2 years? So while we did a lot of programming, I just want to show you how I feel that some of the foundational work I did made it a lot smoother to do work in that
Yes.
office. So remember, Paul, we were on the diversity
Mm-hmm.
committee early
Yes.
on because for those listening, I call my academic
Mm,
sibling because we started teaching the
we
same
did.
year. And I don't know if you jumped on the diversity committee when I did, but I know the diversity committee was the first committee I started on, and I was on there for
Oh,
seven
wow.
years, and I learned a
Mm-hmm.
lot. And yeah, I think I stayed on there for 7 years, and the last year I led. But remember, on that committee, we did initiatives around getting a diversity
Mm-hmm.
higher. Really pushing towards prioritizing departments looking inward to
Mm-hmm.
decide how can we create space? Because I think what it is, it's creating space and it's innovation. And in higher ed, they talk about innovation a lot, but higher ed is such a traditional industry that innovation to maybe a corporate, in the corporate industry, maybe just innovation is just simple. Like, let's just look at our
Mm,
curriculum and see how we could create
right.
space for someone who can bring a different lens and for someone who can do the most important thing we're doing, connecting with
Mm,
our students, just creating space. So, we worked on those documents, those DEI documents where departments had to work on reflection on how they can create space for people who did not fit in that traditional box. And we know that these things are challenging because a lot of the tech that we have traditionally used, they come from more of a dominant culture perspective. So once I transitioned from that, I mean, I remember one of the things too I did in my last year as diversity chair was our
mm,
PDP trying to advocate for us adding a diversity question. And I'm happy to know that
yeah.
that still,
It's still
yeah,
going on. Yep.
maintains in our PDP professional
Mm-hmm.
development plan. It's
Yep.
still going on. So that's why I had to start back there because I think just I didn't realize like when you asked me like
Uh-huh.
I guess I think I'm just DI. I don't think of like it as doing DI work. I just think of it as if I just show up authentically, I guess I am DI in some way. Right. So right. So after I remember in that year as diversity committee
Mm,
chair, I also advocated and worked with the leader of the faculty development office, Dr. Margaret Brown, to have that faculty diversity luncheon,
mm-hmm.
remember?
Mm-hmm.
And the first time I had that, I realized that it was such a transformative space. And I know many institutions and organizations have these groups,
Mm-hmm.
right, where people can feel a sense of belonging. And it's not anything against dominant culture. Really, all it is that going through something a little different here. And I want to make sure that I'm not
Mm,
alone. I want to make sure that I'm not crazy. And I just remember that according to how open you are when some of the challenges you're
mm,
experiencing, you would not tell maybe your
mm,
peers or your leaders, which in most instances are
mm,
dominantly white, from dominant culture, that I what are these comments on my course evaluation? What's going on? You don't feel comfortable because you don't want to feed into those
right.
stereotypes that float around in society
Mm-hmm.
about your people. So I felt as if when we launched that and people got to write down anonymous
Mm-hmm.
questions, it was such a rich space for faculty to
Yeah.
share that, hey, this is what I'm experiencing. And then another faculty can affirm
Mm,
that I'm feeling this
mm,
too. And then we can share solutions because a lot of people think it's just getting together and venting. No, it's really about
mhm,
solutions because we are talented. It's just we may sometimes feel a little suffocated and need some space to
mm,
breathe. So when I was faculty chair, I would say some of the diversity initiatives I implemented thereupon would be, and it was a controversial little thing, would be changing faculty retreat to
mm,
respond to the feedback of faculty. And that's what I said. DEI is not just a
mm,
race thing. It's
mm,
woman. Woman was saying that this is kind of difficult for me. And one of the things that I learned from doing that, and really, I mean, I went again. What was traditional was in reading feedback. I realized that we were categorizing
mm,
men in one
mm,
bucket. There were a lot of the male peers around your age who were saying, I want to be there for my kid when you go to school. So that was the I at
mm,
multiple levels and just really allowing people to feel seen and not just give feedback and it goes nowhere. So that was that. And then when I became the assistant provost of the Faculty Research and Development Office, even though they moved it under the diversity office, it was the
mm,
same thing. I'm serving all the
mhm,
faculty. So really some of the initiatives that I remember just diversity in teaching
mm,
method. I don't know. I don't know if you remember, but this really stood out distinctly. So this woman, she came and she spoke about no grading, like how they have this
mm,
line of thing where people no longer give grades because of the psychological impact it could have. So you find other ways. That's a way of diversity. Someone came and spoke about neurodiversity and what students who fit into that category felt coming out of the
mm,
pandemic.
mm,
So I remember that I also did a panel on diversity of scholarship. So I brought in people like Dr. Newby and different people who they had research shows up in different ways. But as we know in higher ed, according to where you are, there may not be space created for you to get the same levels of
right.
recognition as traditional research. And then, of course, we did a lot of panels on the LGBTQ issue and how we can understand and how we can broaden our perspectives.
I'm also struck by your intentional listening to faculty and their feedback and letting that data then shape the initiatives that you implemented. So thank you for that. And I remember as you name all of these things, right? Remember the sort of the novelty of these experiences, but also the impact they had on faculty and myself as well. In fact, I think participated in one of those panels on different types of scholarship. And I learned so much about, because, you know, I think back then I was especially entrenched in the traditional mode of scholarship, and to be able to hear from others about maybe hear other ways to think about scholarship was really informative. You mentioned this already, but your passion is leadership development. I'm curious for faculty, what are some ways that we can see ourselves as leaders? Because outside of thinking of ourselves as teachers and mentors to students, which is an important aspect of leadership, sometimes I find myself forgetting that I have a leadership role, both in the classroom, but also outside of it. So I'm curious if you could speak to what would that look like for faculty to be intentional about developing their leadership qualities?
That is a great question, Paul. I have long advocated and understood just from, I would say, also from my sales background and also from coming from a Caribbean
Mm,
island where it's like bold authenticity that have to you have to see the context in which you're a leader. So for faculty, I would start with saying that faculty are leaders in the classroom, but the challenge there is that they're leading a group of people that will look up to them automatically, right? So you step in the classroom, and mind you, we're talking about DEI. Different people step in the classroom and may get different responses, but by structural design, the students will automatically revere faculty, look up to them, lead them, and there's a structure in class. And then you're always leading a group of people who are
mhm,
the same age. So as we age, there is that distance there and that age. So you get natural respect not only from position and title, but from age differential, right? You start there. Well, some of the challenges I see in getting faculty to transition into leadership roles is that one, when you're getting your PhD, unless you served in a leadership capacity, it is one of those put your head down, do your research. It's a very
mhm,
siloed journey. When you become faculty, yes, you're in the department, but it's still a very siloed journey, right? Because you can go to your department meeting, you're teaching, go do your research in an office, siloed, and that's a journey, right? So when you transition into these leadership roles, now you're leading your
mm,
peers. And for many academics, according to how they got into these roles, how they got to higher ed, right? Because some people, I know for psychology majors, I remember that in undergrad, they may go undergrad,
mhm.
master's, PhD, and then go teach. So they may have never worked in
Right.
corporate. Where
Mm,
exactly. So where do faculty get the training to be leaders? I have some theories. I used to say, oh wow, I know I taught a couple of classes and when I was doing my doctorate, but who really, really teaches us how to teach? I would argue that the only faculty that have very, very, I guess, intensive training on teaching would be education
mhm,
faculty,
mhm,
right? So we come in and we just learn as we go. Same thing with leading. Where do we learn to lead? So you find that persons who people, the higher ups have identified as
mhm,
potential leaders, they may get sponsored to go to leadership
mm,
training, or they may ask because that may be the faculty who's like, I want to be a provost or a president one day. So they may
mm.
pursue that route. But Paul, we know that that's a small percentage of
Right.
faculty because most academics are there to gain their clout through research and teaching, and leadership roles are seen like service roles that we're fighting to say, hey, well, this person did all the service roles. Why are they not getting the same recognition as the person who just buckled down and
Mm,
did research? So one of the things I really pushed for and was my passion is to develop that faculty leadership training because I realized for the faculty
mm,
chair role, we were just hoping people step up because I found faculty genuinely, they were shy to step into such a public
right.
role and lead their peers. They will serve on lower levels, but they're like, you want me to go and lead all the faculty and liaison with the provost and
Mm,
present to the board. And I think there was a lot of mystery around it. And I saw that and I understood that. And one of the solutions I provided was let me just do my best to educate faculty on what the process looks like, what the role looks like, and have them look inward and say, these are my leadership traits. I had them go talk to their peers
mm,
and colleagues for them to get feedback on three things that people saw in them as leaders. And I think that would have been a slightly innovative approach in and our university providing that leadership development training, but I definitely saw the impact. I saw the impact of people being better prepared to step into leadership roles and just think of themselves as leaders. Just have this space, think of themselves as leaders.
I remember that. I remember that you were very intentional and not only outlining what the position will be, but also the benefits of being a faculty chair. Because, like you mentioned, every year it's a struggle. It's pulling teeth to try to find one person to run. And it seems like I don't have the official data on this, but having one candidate is a win because even getting one person to run for that position has been challenging. But when you implemented sort of that intentional approach, I remember that year we were able to get like a couple of people to volunteer and those who were really qualified to lead. So yeah, I feel like we saw the immediate fruit of that.
Yes. And what if I can add, just for those working in higher ed and small institutions like ours, one of the ways I improved that system, because we had one person running. And as a faculty, I observed that and I said, strategically, we're going to hit a wall. One day we're going to have 0 persons running. That's what happened before I went in my chair-elect year. But I think you won my faculty council, Paul. I think you won my faculty council. Were you? Yes, you were. So one of the ways I implemented a DI approach to the selection process was this. I put up the list of the 225. It's like, okay, but I said, it's not that we don't have people willing to serve. There are 2 main issues. One, we're pursuing the same people over and over again, because sometimes they may be the most visible person. And 2, we have to understand our target market. And I'll use business too. Faculty, I can't speak for faculty at other institutions, but faculty at our institution, they were really humble. So it's not like they're going to pursue these leadership roles. So what happens is you combine those two, a call for someone to lead in such a public role is going to have you going to the same 3 or 4 people and also not getting people who secretly wanted to lead to step up because they were shy and they didn't want to look like if they was chasing power. We also have that Christian hell there. So one of the things I said is no, for us to implement a clear DI through line and be fair and to find the leaders in our departments, which we may not know about. I'm in FCS, you're in psychology, they're natural leaders there. But when do they get highlighted? So I put up the list of 220 faculty and I asked my council to identify names on that list that they felt were leaders. And we came up like about 17 to 20 something. And we sent them letters, personalized letters, saying that you were selected as someone who is being the leader in our community. And then I shared my experience and I told them that one of the ways I wanted to fix this system or improve this system was have an actual democratic process where we had 3 faculty run. So it's not 2, it's 3. So one person doesn't have to feel rejected. It's like, okay, 3 people around, 1 gets selected. But in addition to the other person not feeling rejected, we had like backup. We had faculty who went through the process and they can fill in the other years post my leadership if things got difficult. So I'm saying that DEI is kind of like a through line in a novel. It doesn't have to be orchestrated all the time. I wasn't thinking DEI when I did that. I was thinking this is kind of the right thing to do, to give face to other people. And in doing so, in pursuing what is fair, then you may do DEI in the essay.
It totally does. Yes? It totally does. I'm struck by your making faculty visible, right? Those who might not be readily visible or maybe feeling siloed, but maybe wanting to serve or lead in this capacity. And you had a very purposeful way of bringing them to the light, right? Literally like showing the names to the faculty council, which I must admit was a very, again, unfamiliar approach, but something that was really powerful because we could see literally every single faculty's name on that list, including mine that was shown, right? And someone nudged and said, "Hey, do you want to do this role?" The other thing I'm struck by is your mention of this Christian messaging about humility and how sometimes that gets misapplied to that means that you shouldn't be in the public sphere at all. Like I remember even my own internal struggle about starting this podcast, right? This kind of public scholarship, and how I had this other messaging in my head about humility, right? And how, oh, like, should I really put myself out there? Is this going against my Christian belief, right? And so I know that we have to adjust our thinking to think of public scholarship or public leadership as an act of service, like you mentioned, and not necessarily something that goes against humility, right? And if you think about service as a Christian, as a Christian act, right, then maybe we could even think of public scholarship and public leadership as being a humble act, right? I'm not like 100% there in reality, right? I'm still sometimes struggling with this idea of, oh, how is public scholarship also an act of service and a humbling act, right? But I'm hopefully getting there. Yeah. And so I saw that parallel between what you shared, Raedene, and what I'm experiencing in the area of public scholarship as well.
Yes, because that's what it's called, servant
Mhm.
leadership. And anyone who has dared to say yes to a
Yeah.
leadership role, they know leading is extremely
Yes.
hard. It is extremely hard. The only people, I think, see leadership as as we say, as they say in the streets, a
Mm,
flex. Only people who see that are those people who pursue
mm,
power. Those people who are like, I want that position come whatever me. I want to be like they're fixated on the
yeah.
position versus fixated on the
Mm,
service. But other than that, if your heart is fixated on what Jesus wants us to be fixated on, love your neighbor as yourself, and in so doing, you will show up as
mm,
a leader. You will serve because that's why Jesus was a leader. He
mm,
never said, oh, yeah, I'm Jesus, the Son of God. He never walked
mm,
around like that. He was literally doing
yeah.
service, being stoned, being called a lion. That is actually leading. So, who is going to realistically want to be like, hey, I want to lead? Sign me up, people. I'm not going to do like people are not going to do that. And also, people have mirrors to themselves. I would say people they can look inside and see how they weren't as kind to a leader, and sometimes they may have that reflexive process of, well, will I be treated that way? And as a psychologist, I'm sure you could maybe talk about that theory, but I do think people sometimes don't want to lead because they sometimes know how mean and unkind
Right.
they are when they're a follower because it's so much easier to
Right. Right.
criticize than be part of the
Yeah.
solution. So,
No, that's really well put. And I think it's powerful to think about example of Jesus and his life, like you said, and how it was all about action, right? It was not about the flex, as you put it, but it was all about the action. And I feel like, again, going back to DEI, sometimes, and of course, we all struggle with this to some extent. And so I'll use myself as an example. That temptation to sort of perform, that performative allyship where like I come across as culturally competent, right? That mentality can sometimes take over where it's not about serving others, but it becomes all about like presenting myself in a certain way, right? And this is me being vulnerable and sharing, right? But that mentality is a real temptation in my sinful state that I kind of become consumed with what other people would think of me rather than the action of creating a belonging environment, for example, for my students. And so that's something that I have to constantly keep check, right? That constantly keep in mind that I have to resist that urge or that temptation to engage in performative allyship and instead be all about that action.
I will say that goes back to that
Hmm.
branding, which we will
Mm,
speak on, soon. But it's this idea that when you get into any
yeah.
structure, right? Any organizational structure, there is a set
Mm,
culture there. And when you go
yeah.
counterculture, you get
Mm,
whiplash. And that is what it is. So literally, Paul, what I would say to you is that you would display a survival mechanism. You would display as think of being a professor. Sometimes the professors who push their students
mm,
the hardest, they're the ones who may get graded
mm,
the lowest. Now, in 2 decades, the student may look back and be like, oh, I didn't like that professor. That professor was so hard. But that's the professor that helped me
mm,
develop grit. That's the first professor that did not let
mm.
me slide. But in that current culture, in that moment in time, people are genuinely in their sinful state and our sinful state,
Yeah.
self-survey. So as a student, you want the easiest path to the grade you want. I'm not even going to say you want an A because I have learned and accepted that some people
Mm,
just want a B. Some people
mm,
just want to pass, and that's okay. That's their prerogative. But I'm saying that when this idea of
mm,
branding and, is that we, for whatever reasons, and everything starts in our childhood psychologically and that developmental stage and the broader macro culture that you were raised in, there is a set way to be. And people who step out
mhm,
of that, there are consequences. And we know that. However, that's the thing. If you live in your authentic self and truth, eventually people will come back and
mm,
realize, wow, thank you for leading the way.
mhm,
Thank you for speaking up. Thank you for doing something different. But that's the
mhm,
burden, though. Some people, they're not cut out to be the zebra with
mm,
no stripe.
mm.
They're not cut out to be the zebra with no stripes. And that's okay too. So it's all about knowing your calling and finding spaces where you can flourish and be your
Yeah.
authentic self. But you don't have to run someone
Right.
else's race. But if there's a tingling inside of you that says, I'm being inauthentic, well, you have to
Right.
address
Right.
that.
Yeah. And there are external forces too, like institutional culture that could contribute to that inauthenticity. You brought up branding, so I wanted to get to that question because that word branding, for some listeners, especially those who grew up in a certain Christian context, might trigger some reactions. And so I know what you mean by brand, but can you elaborate a little bit more about how you define branding and how faculty might embrace that as something that is part of their professionalism, part of their authentic life, part of their Christian calling? How does branding speak into those areas?
Thank you for asking that question. I think so. The concept of personal branding has been, I mean, trending for, let's say, almost 2 decades now, right? Almost 2 decades. But we've always been communicating something
Mm,
consistently. And that's all it
mm,
is. So if we start with the business model, a brand is a promise. A brand is what your target
mhm,
market and those who aren't even in your target market come to
mm,
associate you with,
mm,
right? So it's what they come to
mm,
associate you with. And that's it. Now, even though we're using business
mhm,
term to apply to humans, it's really to provide a theoretical framework for individuals to realize that you may think that you're not communicating anything. But in thinking that, one, you are wrong. And two, you are communicating many things. And if you think of yourself as a business, right? Porn Incorporated, you will sit down and you will categorize the areas of your life. So you will say, okay, what Paul,
mhm,
personal, right? Personal Paul. I used to tell my students, just close your eyes, think of yourself as the only
mm,
person on earth. Who will you be and what
mm,
will you do? If you didn't have all those stereotypes, the family dreams for you and the institutional context and so forth. So that's Paul. So you write down that, like, who is Paul as a brand? Who is his core values? What does Paul like to do? Who's
mm,
Paul, right? But then what happens is as we grow older, Paul's life becomes more
mhm,
complex. So Paul has a family, Paul
mm,
has a wife, Paul has a job he needs to keep to feed himself and his family. Paul has to keep his job or perform a certain way at his job to get to the level of success he wants. Paul has a social life. He has a social
mm,
network of friends. Who does Paul show up with in that social network of friends? Right? So Goffman will argue that at some
mm,
point, our identities he will say that it's all a
Mhm.
stage, right? I just love government. He will say it's all a stage. And we have these different hats that we wear. But at some point, according to how your groups mix, they may be like, that's that's the Paul you've
Mhm.
been talking about. That's not the
Mm,
Paul
mm,
I know in my social context. That's not the Paul. So that's an example of what government is saying, that when everyone is wearing certain hats, but then when their different circles mesh and they come on the same stage, if there's not an authenticity there, I will add this, that people will start saying that, oh, that's not what I remember about this
mm,
person. There's an
mhm,
inconsistency
mhm,
there. So going back to the question, what is a brand? A brand is what people will come to know
mm,
about you. How do they come to know this about you? By your intentional and consistent
mm,
communication of who you are,
mm,
non-verbally and verbally. Okay,
mhm,
non-verbally is just your body gestures, kinetics. It could be how you walk. Somebody could say, I know it's that. I know that's
mm,
Paul because of his walk. How you dress, all of those things are non-verbal. Your hairstyle, everything about that, non-verbal. And then verbally, when you speak, not only what do you say, the inflection in your voice, the depth of your voice, right? And you would find, like, for example, if we call in Michael Jackson, people will argue that Michael Jackson's voice wasn't that high. It was a voice he started
mm,
using at some point in his life. But if you speak to him behind closed doors, he was like, hey,
mm,
Michael. I don't know how true
mm,
that is, but that is an example of him deciding at some point throughout his trajectory that he wanted to be perceived a certain way because clearly he felt it was beneficial
mm,
to him. So for faculty, when I was on board in faculty in my role as assistant provost, or anytime I mentored faculty or came to speak for anything I said, the first thing you want to decide is what is your passion? So you're coming into this institution. What is your passion? Are you going to be known for a top researcher? Are you going to be known for a top
mm,
teacher? Right? A top professor, you do better. Are you going to be known for service and
mhm,
leadership? Right? Because those are three parts in higher ed. And what happens is if faculty do not think of themselves in that way, do not have a strategic approach to when they show up, I think they may get disoriented at
mhm.
some point because academia is
Yeah.
challenging. It is challenging. So if you're like, okay, when I started, Paul, if I was like, I am going to be a top researcher like Paul, but genuinely, I did good research, but I don't
Mm,
love research. And I'm spending most of my time trying to be a top
mm,
researcher like Paul. I may live a pretty unhappy life in
mm,
higher
mm,
ed,
mhm,
right? So then I may say, hey, I will do enough
mhm,
research to, to meet the standards and the criteria, but my real job is teaching, right? Or you may say, hey, I love teaching because I get to develop students and I get to learn, continuously learn. But my job is going to be service and
mm,
leadership. And after a while, I'm going to move into leadership roles because all of those parts are very
mhm,
viable parts. And there's nothing wrong with it. The issue is when we don't realize that we are empowered to make that decision, but no one can make that decision for you. I always tell people, if you don't know who you are, people are going to tell you who you are. If you don't know who you are, you're going to choose the wrong
mhm.
mentors.
Yeah, thank you. I think that really clarifies sort of my understanding of what you mean by branding and how it's very compatible with our vocation as professors, as with our faith as Christians. So thank you again for highlighting and outlining all of that. This is a question that I know you are passionate about because you wanted to talk about this. So how does that idea of branding translate to higher education? Meaning, do you think higher education and specifically Christian liberal arts higher education, is there a brand that they should pursue? Is there a brand at the level of not just individual faculty, but also as institutions of Christian higher education?
Yes, so I'll first ask you this.
Mm,
Is higher ed a business model?
mm. I think so. I think there's There's a lot of overlap there, right? Yeah.
It's a business model, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a nonprofit.
Mm-hmm.
So it is a business model. The NFL is the NFL
Yes.
supposedly is a nonprofit. Okay. So the point I'm making is that our nonprofit status does not, it's a business model, right? So
Mm.
if we know this, if you don't have tuition dollars, you
You,
can't operate.
right.
So the point I'm making is that branding and really in the higher ed landscape is just higher ed is a competitive landscape. So it's a
Mm-hmm.
market. Okay. And Christian higher ed is one of the service providers in that market landscape.
Mm.
Right? Okay. So the question now is how can those leading and creating Christian higher ed institutions differentiate themselves?
Mm-hmm.
And it's not even a matter of how can they, how do they want to differentiate themselves? Because by just saying Christian higher ed, you're already branded.
Mm.
The issue, as I said, with individuals branding themselves is that you have to control
Mm.
what people say about your specific institution
Mm.
because people are going to bring their stereotypes
Mm-hmm.
of what Christian means to them. And we know that Christian means a lot of different things
Right.
to different people based on their travels, stories, and experiences. So Christian higher ed does have a brand. I
Mm.
would advocate, and I've always advocated that it goes back to that theoretical framework.
Mm.
Who are we?
Mm.
What differentiates us? And what do we want to be known for? Because the Christian landscape is huge. But you have to fit in there in an authentic way, but you also have to survive. And I would argue that in an effort sometimes, and we all struggle. So think of the negotiating identity you were speaking of, right? It's survival. So in any competitive landscape, the market is going to go through highs and lows. That's just what it is because the consumer, their appetite changes, right?
Mm.
So we know in higher ed, the pandemic changed the appetite
Mm-hmm.
of how students wanted to learn because they got a taste of something new,
Right.
right? So you're always navigating the vicissitude of a
Mm.
competitive landscape.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what may happen in that journey for businesses and for ourselves is you start negotiating your identity.
Mm.
You may start not marketing a foundational tenet of
Mm.
what your institution was built on. You may highlight some aspect and diminish or just not talk about some other aspect. But at some point, like we are as individuals, you're going to have to pay the piper in that if you are not living an authentic and bold embodiment of
Mm.
who you are and your core values, at some point you may come across tensions where people are going to call on you to say, they're going to say, who are you? And anytime people are asking, who are you? And people feel lost about who you are, Paul, the onus is on us. Like somewhere along the way, we communicated mixed messages that led your target audience,
Mm-hmm.
your stakeholders to feel a level of disillusionment or confusion
Mm.
about who you genuinely are.
Mm.
And that's all I will say. And it doesn't matter what institution. That's what I'm saying about branding. It's just a theoretical framework that, yes, requires you to adapt
Mm.
to survive,
Mm-hmm.
but you have to define the parameters of what adaptation looks like. And you have to make sure that your target audience, your stakeholders, don't believe that you veered so far to another end that they felt lost. So that's what I'm saying. You have to be, there has to be a level of fluidity, right? Because we're growing and we're getting new information and we're experiencing new things, right? So that's like any business model, any institution, higher ed. But the core of you, who you are, like if you say, hey, if I think of who's Paul Kim, I think of a dedicated teacher. I think of a top researcher. I think of a kind guy. If one day, I just see you behaving outside of that, and you're like, well, I was always this. And I'm like, well, when did you get to the communicate that? Right? So that's what I'm saying. The core of who you are. It is very dangerous to not consistently communicate that, because at some point you may confuse your stakeholders and they may feel lost, not because of anything they believed. As I said earlier, your brand is being communicated by your behavior and by what you say you are and by your marketing and a lot of stuff. So if people get lost, it's really not their fault. It's actually that somewhere in the marketing process, somewhere in the evolution, you may have moved away from some of the things that you want to stand on at some point in time, and people got confused. So that's what I would say about Christian higher ed. I have always said, tell me who you are. I have this personal saying, give me the right to choose.
Mm,
Tell me who you are and stand by that.
mhm,
And I know what to expect, and I can choose if I want to be part of this or if I don't want to be part of this. And
mhm,
to me, that is all you can expect of any person or any institution or
mhm.
any corporation. So
Yeah. No, this is great. So many things to think about, and I hope that folks are listening, especially those in Christian higher education, and thinking about how their brand is something that they're communicating or not communicating. I was also struck by your point that not communicating a brand or being confused about your brand is also a brand, right? That yeah,
yes,
you come across as confused, like are you this or are you that? And I think that balance between flexibility and adaptability, but also remaining true to your core identity is something that really came across in your description. Mhm. Wow. I have a question that relates to your personal identity as well, and also something that's a connecting point to me as well. So both of us share in this identity of having significant amount of time in the US, but also outside of the US as well, right? That we have sort of this global experience that has shaped us and continued to shape us. And so I guess I wanted to speak to you a bit and share stories about how that global perspective impacts your leadership and DEI work as you're living and working in the US. And if you've seen any rewards and also challenges of that as well.
I would circle back to my introduction when I said that my leadership approach really comes from my authentic center and coming from a very grounded family structure, which I realize the older I've gotten is a privilege. It is a privilege to know that your parents are always going to be there, to know that they love you. Like that is a privilege. And I think that can show up in leadership, right? Because what it is that if you're grounded in your family unit, then it allows you to show up a little braver, right? A lot braver because you have that foundation. You have the people who, I mean, they love you unconditionally. And then I have that broader culture of my Trinbagonian culture. That's just an abbreviation of Trinidad and Tobago. And we are a very festive, authentic people. And I don't know if I will say it's anything about proud. It's just about ease of socializing and communication and being yourself and laughing and not taking things too seriously. So that foundation allowed me to transition as a and with my individual personality, right? Because you're a psychologist, there's nature and nature. I was always a grounded child, but that allowed me to transition into the US and process the lessons that I had to learn about being an Afro Trinidadian in a US market, pursuing success and excellence. And I have, in previous talks, I always share this that my foundation, I see it as lucky that I got a full academic scholarship to North Carolina Central University, which was a historically Black institution. And the reason I say that is because that became my launch pad. That became where I went, and I was other because I was from a different country. I was foreign. I had an accent. So it was a very interesting experience. If I stood in a picture, no one would know I was from a different country. But as soon as I spoke, they're like, oh, where are you from? Where's that accent from? And in doing so, in being the same but different, it was my first introduction to DEI, right? Luckily, there were a number of other Trinidadians there, but it was my first introduction to DEI. But it was also a very safe introduction to what it meant to be Black in America because I was able to get authentic stories from my colleagues and not stories from the media, not curated stories from the media. So when I went to college, my peers, their parents were the ones who couldn't go into the bathroom. Their parents were the ones, their parents. So it wasn't that far away from when the Jim Crow era, when they couldn't go into the bathrooms and so forth. So they told those stories. I remember one time Paul thinking, oh, why are you afraid to go to interviews? I had never thought that. They were so afraid to go to interviews, some of them, right? Because it's not within the framework of just Black America to leave and go out. We know most of these businesses are dominant culture. And I remember thinking, like, why is there this anxiety there, this fear there? And I realized in that moment that was a privilege of my foreignness. That was a privilege of growing up in a culture, never having to really worry about the color of my skin outside of Eurocentric influences and colorism. Like we like to skin this type of skin. But outside of that, I never felt that I couldn't achieve what I could achieve. Like it never crossed my mind that if I wanted to be president, I could be president. It never crossed my mind to think, oh, these roles are not built for me. So what happens sometimes, according to the culture you come from, you enter America with a bodaciousness. You enter America with a confidence. But through your lived experiences in America, according to your demographic, is a journey and a struggle because now you're being immersed into this new culture. And I can speak for myself where all these stereotypes about people who look like you are not positive, right? And it's steeped in a very sordid history. So I would say those experiences being at a historically Black university, having my first job, having, a man, tell me that I don't want, I don't want her. I don't want that girl. I don't want her drive. I don't want her to drive me. Can you give me someone? Why? Going through those experiences early, I will say though, I was able to do that because my Black peers in undergrad prepared me. As I moved on, I would say the breaking point for me, Paul, was when there were like all the police shootings. It was always happening. It's part of the history, but it was on media and they sensationalized it. And the migrant, I will tell you, I used to show up in classes. I used to teach appearance and culture. And anytime I reached the topic on race, I would start crying. It was so heavy. And I remember I called my mom bawling on the phone because it was just the first time it just became so palatable. And I was in America maybe 17 years, 16 years at that stage. And I remember my mom saying, really, I'm really concerned about you. Like, you have to take care of yourself because she's not there, right? You're in this country by yourself. If you have a sibling there in another state, she's like, I don't know what to do. And one of my solutions for surviving while Black and having to deal with these things in the media was just to cut out cable news and listen to curated news, like find people who on YouTube and choose what I listen to rather than what I think subconsciously do. You just put on CNN, you put on Fox, you put on MSNBC, and you let it run the whole day. And these stories are repeating and repeating for days.
Right.
And you're like, you can't run from them. And it was one of my PhD peers who was like, "Girl, you still listen to cable news like that's just like, girl, not good for your mental health." And it was that moment she kind of gave me the right to choose. I was like, oh, I can listen to the news and read the news. I can just choose to control how I do this and show up. So that background led me to, I would say, the thus far the pinnacle of my career, working in higher ed and so forth, and having that heart
Mm.
and that lens and that heart of others.
Mm.
So I have always said, when I lead, I can relate. I could have related to my white students, not lie. I remember I had a white student one time said, why do I have to feel guilty to be white?
Mm.
And I was like, that is very good. That is a good start.
Mm.
That is a good start. To name it and whatever content I was teaching that they made her feel
Mm.
defensive.
Mhm.
And I said, that is a good start. You
Mm.
don't have to feel guilty to be white. Just like a man doesn't have to feel guilty to be a man. Just like somebody doesn't have to feel guilty to be born into a rich family. What you have to do is enlighten yourself. What you
Mhm.
have to do is find something within yourself where you're other.
Mm.
Find something
Mm.
and then tap into that hurt. Tap into that feeling of they don't get me. They don't understand that I am just so and so and so. And tap into that feeling
Mm.
and use that. Empathize with other people's lived experiences.
Mm.
So that is what I was able to use that outsider insider
Mhm.
perspective to
Mhm.
do. And when I led, I literally led for everyone, like the initiatives and the things I did. I didn't lead from the lens of, oh, I knew I was a Black leader, a Black foreign leader. I knew I had that tripartite minority status, but I just led based on what was just
Mm.
and what were the pain points? Like if the pain point was that our grant system was broken and researchers like you who wanted to just do more research and got grants felt like the system was onerous, I stuck out my neck and I negotiated to get that system fixed. And that's not a color of skin thing. That is just if you have the capacity and the strategic skill sets to make a difference, if you create a more positive culture and people see that, hey, when I speak, I mean, like I have this thing called a hard no.
Mm.
There's a hard no, right? I learned that from Provost Manduzwa. He was like, wait, that's a hard no, right? And I loved it. I was like, that was great. It's such a hard line. How hard knows this idea that you're going to get everything you want in life? According to Dr. Romney, you're not sick and life is not a fairy tale. No, you're not going to get everything you want. But if you have leaders who you feel are leading from just the general voice and
Mm.
taking feedback and you're not seeing differential treatment, I do think that you can lead and leave a global footprint because to be in a global society, you have to be able to step outside and feel what it is like to be other. So
Mhm.
I would say that's my journey and that's the theoretical approach I use
Mm.
to lead.
I love it because it's not a colorblind or culture blind approach, but you're very intentional about infusing your global perspective into the US context. And even that example of talking to that student about white guilt and how you're saying that, yeah, you don't have to feel that way, but it's also not bad as a starting point for action, right? And so I love that you are able to balance or infuse those perspectives. And I think you used the phrase privilege of being a foreigner, right? Where like when I came to the US initially, I think some of the racialized experiences of Asian Americans, those experiences were not familiar to me. Like it was not a lived experience for me. And so sometimes I would make certain assumptions that were not true for the Asian American community. And like you, with more and more years in the US, gaining that experience has allowed me to better empathize with the Asian American community. And to a point where now I would describe myself as Korean American or Asian American, that intentional sort of embracing of that culture, even though,
I am in this with you.
yes, I'm in this with you, even though I didn't spend my formative years as an adolescent in the US, right? When I look at my Korean American peers, I am sort of an outlier in the sense that most of my peers were born in the US, right? But I spent my formative years outside of the US. And sometimes those perspectives can really serve as barriers to empathizing, but also they can help me empathize better and also provide a global perspective. I, as you know, take students to South Korea for a study abroad, and that's been really fun in connecting my Korean identity, but also my Korean American identities. And yeah, that's one of the favorite things I do as a professor, which is lead the South Korea study abroad program.
Yes, and can I add something? So you spoke on something really enlightening there, right? Because I always say when I speak, I can't speak for the entirety of the Black community. I can just speak from the lens of being Afro Trinidadian in the United States. And now I've lived in the United States longer than I have in Trinidad. But as you can tell, I'm very authentically Trinidadian, but with the exposure and influences of American culture. But I do think that even it's easy to think like, when people say go back to your country or whatever, you're like, yeah, I definitely can. I mean, it definitely is a choice, right? But don't miss the opportunity that you have of having people of different cultures in your space. And that is what I'm talking about, leading from a global footprint, not going to another country to lead. I'm talking about
Mm,
right here in America, we're a
mm-hmm,
melting pot. And
mm,
one of the things I put in my syllabus, and I used to tell my students that diversity in the classroom with global diversity is the cheapest trip around the world. Like you have these peers here, and instead of you find the way and finding people similar to you, why don't you be intentional and meet somebody from Ghana, pair up on a team with someone from Korea? Because now, instead of having to Google
mm,
for a project, you can speak to that person, you can get their lived experiences, and then you can compare and contrast the information you're finding on the internet with their lived experiences. Now you can travel to their world and have a friend as a tour guide. Like, what's wrong with that? And that is the opportunity missed when we want to do DEI and we want to diversify, but we want everyone like, okay, if your corporation just had zebras in it and the person comes in with just two stripes, you're like, huh, you're not the right type of zebra. It's like, oh, that's cool. Maybe I'm that friend.
mm,
Maybe I am that innovative perspective, but that's the richness and the opportunity. And research has shown
mm,
that corporations who do diversity well, have diverse boards, diverse leaders, they increase sales, they have better customer service, they have more revenue, and they're able to operate at a higher level. But it's really hard to do a heterogeneous culture well.
mm,
And it's easier for people to do homogeneity
mm,
because you can cross out at least two of the DEI categories. Okay, we're all this and we're all from the same country. So now
mm-hmm,
we just have to deal with the rest of these.
right.
But if you have to do DEI on all the demographics,
Mm-hmm,
that's a lot of work. And
yeah.
it's not, but
Re-
it's rich.
requires sometimes very difficult conversations as well, right? Because
Yeah.
some people have used the word like DEI Olympics or something like that, where like different
Oh,
groups
my
might
goodness.
compete for resources or seemingly competing for resources. So I'm always thinking about, let's not make it a competition, but let's make it a thing where, like you described, everyone benefits from that conversation and from those efforts. I also am struck by the idea that within the classroom, we can encourage this. We don't have to tell students necessarily, oh, you have to go to that mission trip, right? Which like short-term mission trips have their own issues as well. That's a tangent, right? But
Yeah.
like you don't have to study abroad, right? You don't have to go on that short-term study abroad because that's expensive and you might not be able to go because of the costs, right? But what about within the classroom, exploring ways where you can make those connections? So like I have a very simple assignment in my classroom where it's a cross-cultural experience that one has to do and then reflect on the psychological theories from that experience. And one of the things I suggest to students is don't seek out like a expensive or like a time consuming experience. Just talk to someone in the classroom, talk to a classmate who's different from you from one dimension of culture and interview them and write a reflection on that. And sometimes that can yield really fruitful discussions and reflections. So I guess I'm reinforcing your point that doesn't have to be something fancy, something outside of the classroom that students do, but within the classroom, those connections can be really meaningful as well.
Yes. And just to piggyback off what you're saying, I had an assignment called Walk a Mile and a
Mm,
Half in Someone Else's Shoes.
mm,
And the assignment was a broad scope DEI. It was an
mhm,
appearance and culture, right? A broad scope DEI assignment. So I told them, find someone who is different to you, right? Different from you in any of the demographic categories. It could be age, it could be sex, it could be gender, it could be socioeconomic status, it could be culture, whatever. But you have to have strong stereotypes about that group of people without any lived experience. That was the specific strong stereotype without any lived experiences. And I gave them questions to do so. And one of my most enlightening stories, if I can share, is having a Black student in my class was adopted. So, and
mhm,
in Washington, when the student, at least when we started, I think we have diversified to a point where we have more students of different racial and ethnic backgrounds. I quickly learned that some of the Black students in my class, they were adopted by white parents, right?
mhm,
That's in that way. So I would never forget reading that paper where that student interviewed another Black person for.
mm, mm,
She interviewed another Black person. That was
mm,
her interviewing somebody different because
mhm,
she was socialized in white culture.
right.
So she was racially Black, but ethnically white
Mhm,
because she was adopted and the area she lived in. And I remember being struck by the fact that she was like, yes, I wanted to ask this, Black person, what was their lived experience and what it means to them to be Black. And she said, I didn't know. Like it was so hard to be Black.
mm,
It was so enlightening. And it goes back to the idea of what I was saying that I went to a historically Black university.
mhm,
If you take a picture of one of them, I look the same, but yet still, I was different. And for this student, she was definitely Black, not
mm,
even like, no, she was Black. But because she was socialized in a different ethnicity, she did not, like, she more than likely told she was just a person in America.
mhm,
So when she is hearing
mm,
these stories on TV, seeing these news, subconsciously she may have just said, yeah, I don't know, but I know this from other stories. Younger persons navigating being Black in American, predominantly white spaces, they will say, yeah, but I am not that type of Black person.
mm, mm,
So there's a level of distancing because you were told that you're just a person, but you're different. You are not those type of people.
mhm.
So
Yeah. I mean, your example speaks to the importance of recognizing the heterogeneity even within cultural groups, right? In this case, Black folks in the US, where there's a importance in recognizing the different types of lived experiences and how uh, within those groups, right, we need to foster conversations as well. So thank you for sharing that example. I have two questions, Raiden, that I ask all guests on my podcast. So one is focused on higher education, the other focused on teaching. So one question is, what advice might you have for Christian academics who are just beginning their careers? And my hope for this podcast is that it reaches audiences like graduate students who are about to get their degree, PhD, and faculty who are just starting out in Christian higher ed. What advice might you have for these folks?
I would say that there's a lot of impact to be made. I will say that Christian higher ed is a unique space and there is such rich opportunity there to make a difference
Mm,
and represent something different.
mm,
But it's going to take intentionality. I would argue that one of the privileges we had of teaching at a Christian private institution is the small classes, right?
mhm,
So the small student, teacher to student ratio. And really what that privilege is that you really get to know your students. I kid you not, Paul. Like yesterday or the past couple of days, I have one of my students messaging me like, Dr. Copeland, I'm
mm.
back in Hawaii. Okay, this is what I want to do with my life. This is what I want to do. Okay, what you think? I, yeah, because I just remember having a student who transitioned from a larger institution
Mm,
in our area and saying that, wow, I never knew this was possible.
mm,
I never knew that I could be in a space where the professor sees me,
mm,
where the professor knows me by name,
mm,
where I can message the professor, where the professor cares about my lived experience,
mm,
right? That is, yes, it might be a private institution model, right? In terms of you go to a small, intimate, university. But I think on a bigger level,
mm,
even non-Christian parents and students will come to a Christian higher ed institution because of its foundational core values.
mm,
And I would say faculty transitioning, at our university, you have to be Christian, you have to sign
mhm,
that faith statement and so forth. It is that opportunity to no longer say, oh, I said Jesus. I remember thinking that when I was at a public institution, I used to be like, oh, Jesus, look, I
mm,
said Jesus, right? Is that
mm,
opportunity to live in the full embodiment of who
mm,
you are. Now,
mm,
what I would say for faculty transitioning into institutions like ours, where you got to be different types of Christian,
mhm,
is to live into that, be your authentic
mm,
self. Because in DEI, as we know, you cannot stereotype. You don't know what student needs what type of Christian
mhm,
counseling. You
mm,
cannot make an assumption. You
mm,
can't say, oh, because they're black, they're Democratic, because they're white, they're
mhm,
Republican,
mm,
because they're Asian, because their parents were rich. You can't do that. You just
mm,
have to show up authentically, have that open door policy. And before you pour into them, you listen more
mm,
than you speak.
mm,
You let them show up authentically. You model authenticity, but you figure out what they need. And sometimes the opportunity there in loving our students the way Christ loves us is that you get to identify that student's needs.
mm,
So I have had faculty, and I mean, I can think about them and I smile now, email me and say, Raedene, I have this student. And I really think the student needs a mentor like you.
mm,
Can you email that student? Can you take that student under your wings? And I remember receiving that and thinking, that to me is Christian High. It's like you realize where you tapped out. You're like, I have tried, but I am limited. So I think the student may do best if you just kind of take them under your wings, meet with them. And those are some of the beautiful things I experienced at our specific university. I can't say for other people's Christian higher ed experience, but I know and I feel privileged say that for I have been there 13 years, right? I can say for the most part, I was able to show up authentically. I mean, I dared to do it because that's the only way I know how to be. But I felt, and you know this, Paul, I showed up authentically in my true Trinidadian embodiment with my colorful heels and colorful clothes. I showed up as me. And I know if people say, hey, remember Raedene? Oh, yes, she used to wear those heels. I showed up that way. And to me, I learned that as a Christian community, even though I was, as I said, foreign, aesthetically different, like black, where we didn't have a lot of black faculty, I felt loved. And I realized that's a privilege. And that's my story that I felt loved. I felt encouraged. And even in my lowest moments, I had peers who had my back. And to me, I will always hold that experience there. And I pray that other people transitioning to Christian higher ed are privileged enough to get department chairs like that, to get colleagues like that, because that was my lived experience. And I would say, as a leader, I remember you were asking, as a leader, what are some of the challenges? I want to pinpoint something here. Yes, you're a minority in a space where, for the most part, it's white Christian ed, right? It's white Christian, it's a white evangelical system for the most part. Now we know they're like Catholic institutions, but we're in this white evangelical space. And if people say, how were you able to achieve that? I would say, honestly, it seems like an odd question, but it's my sales and negotiation background. It's a big part of my leadership training. I tell people, and it is what I believe, when you think, why did I not get the things I want in life? I would argue, yes, a percentage of it could be that the person just doesn't like how you look or whatever. But we can't change that. So what can you change? What you can change is your strategic approach to pursuing goals.
Mm.
So I know in some of the things I did in Christian higher ed, I understood, I took as a given the heart of the person.
Mm.
I took as a given that if we're there, we were socialized on a God that was love and who wanted us to love each other. I did not assume that because I was Black, they're going to reject me. I was this. I did not put any of that. I just looked at that person as a human. I looked at them as a brand. And I looked at them as someone who cared what people thought about them and also had their own core values and their own sensitivities and their own psychographics. And what I would do is when I was approaching someone to negotiate an improvement in a system, I will approach them from who they are
Mm.
and not from I
Mm.
am. So that's the core of sales and negotiation.
Mm.
You think of the other person, you think of their sensitivities, you think of, okay, if they're the provost, there are a lot of stuff you don't know that's going on that they have limitations on, but they can't tell you because it's lonely at the top. So you go to that person and you say, hey, I know this has been traditionally this way. I know that it's the higher faculty. I understand that you want to be seen as a good leader. So I have really studied some of the feedback you've given over the years. I've studied some of your objections, and I want to meet you in the middle. So understanding that you care a lot about this and wanting to not let our culture decline any more in morality, in terms of, how we felt, faculty moral and so forth. How about we try this system that reflects and allows you still to have the things you deem are important, but also show the faculty that you're listening and you care. So that is just my approach, period. I can't change the fact that I'm Afro-Trinidadian, I have kinky hair. I can't change that, and I'm not going to change that. But what I can do is strategize better. What I can do is see the other person as someone who's wanting to do good. So all I have to do is tell them that I understand that they want to do good and provide them with something that reflects some of their sensitivity.
Yeah. No, that's great. It makes me want to take a negotiation class or a marketing class.
Yes.
Yeah.
With
Yeah.
the negotiation with your kids, with your spouse. Like in relationships, we're constantly negotiating. Hey, I want to go and eat this. No, I don't want to go eat this. But negotiation is not going back on branding. It's not negotiating to have a zero-sum game. It is learning negotiation strategies to have a mutually beneficial partnership.
Yeah.
And
Everybody
that's
wins. Yeah.
different.
Yeah.
Everybody wins, but one person doesn't get the whole pie.
Right.
It's just if you learn to communicate more effectively and more strategically as academics, I think they sometimes feel, I did the research. Here's the data. You should change. They get data all the time.
Yeah.
People get data all the time. I know when I was presenting to the board, Paul, I thought to myself, I looked at the board and I thought, 75% of the board, they're corporate professionals. So I thought to myself, when I present to them, I need to present to them more from a business lens and not an academic lens. So I would think, okay, they're business professionals. They're busy. They think a certain way, while academic could read like 30 pages. When I led, I thought they can only read maybe 2 or 3 pages. And we know serving on a board is a lot of stuff. So that's what I'm talking about. That is part of thinking, I can't give them a big report. I would give them something substantive, but in a way that they can digest it, understanding how their brain is wired to think. So,
wow, amazing stuff. Thank you, Raedene. I know I want to respect your time, but I have one quick last question, if that's okay.
Yes.
So I asked this again to everyone, but if you could ask my next guest any question about teaching, and I typically ask about teaching psychology, but sometimes our guests are outside of psychology like you, which is wonderful. Well, what would it be? Any question to ask our next guest, whether they're in psychology or somewhere in the social sciences, what question would you ask them?
Yeah, Paul, I saw that question and I didn't come up with something beforehand. I said I'm
Mm,
going to let
yeah.
just give an organic answer.
Mm,
But as we're talking about, one of this thing, leading and dynamic, everyone can come to a breaking point. And I think it would be really interesting
mm,
to investigate what would be your breaking point. Like
mm,
when you think of your career,
mm,
what is something that could happen that you're like,
mm,
I can't do this anymore? And I don't know why I thought about it that way, because
mm,
I think it's a reverse way of leading, right? So if you ask your employees, write down one thing that can happen at this company that will make you quit, it would be actually revealing to see what is their breaking point. And it's interesting because, as a psychologist, people are motivated by different things. Some people are motivated by money, but they may be in the lesser category. I think there's a point where, okay, I need money just to survive, right? So once people cross that point and are making enough money to survive, the extra money becomes bonus, 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 right? But I think we may be surprised to find out the things that people truly care about. And I know I came up with that because I guess I came up with that because going back to this idea of empathy,
mm,
when I go towards leaders, I think of empathy, like, why are they drawing such a hard line?
mm,
Right? Or what are the hard lines they're drawing? And I do think if sometimes we ask questions in a reverse way, it's truly, truly revealing, because
mhm.
what are things you desire? Well, those are things they desire, but that doesn't mean that the list of things they desire will be something that would make them walk away
Right.
from your company or career. So I don't know. That just came to me. I don't
No,
know
that's
why.
great. I'm glad you were inspired to ask that because that data will be so revealing, especially for certain themes that come up that are surprising. Hopefully, the biggest theme is not just money, right? Although that's important,
I
right?
doubt it
But
would come up. Yeah, I
yeah,
doubt it would
but
come up.
there might
Because
be
we
other
know for a
things.
fact people
Mhm.
can work at a place a long time
Yeah,
and not
yeah,
make the most money they
right,
can.
right. Yeah. Thank you, Raedene. This has been amazing. Do you have anything else you'd like to add?
No, it's just want to thank you for having me, Paul. It's a privilege to see you shine and flourish. And I hope we never become strangers. And yeah, it's just been a privilege to serve with you and see you stepping out of
Mm,
your shell and doing more public things, because I believe God has great things in store for you, and you have to make yourself a little uncomfortable
mm.
to become all that He has slated for you to be. So thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. And I'll just echo the same sentiments. And I admire your courage and being such a great leader. And I continue to follow your work. And I hope, like you said, that we'll stay connected. Thank you, Raedene.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you for listening to the Cross Cultural Psych Podcast with Dr. Paul Youngbin Kim. We hope this content was meaningful. If you enjoyed the podcast, we invite you to write a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Also, let us know what you'd like to see covered in future episodes. We hope you will join us next time.